Chapter 28 Insomniac Investigation. After convincing Rainbow Dash to let her tag along, Twilight allowed the conversation to fall silent for a time. Both of them needed a few moments to calm down and process what had happened anyway, and neither of them were really ready to break the silence. But they had ample time to do so, as all of Rainbow Dash's twisting and turning about to try and shake Twilight off her tail had resulted in them ending up rather far away from her objective. Or at least that's what she claimed. So if nothing else, they had plenty of time to get their thoughts in order. And the moonlit stroll the two found themselves on served as a good method of doing just that, even if the moon itself seemed to be at the center of all this. With Twilight's admittedly vague knowledge of both the Mare and the Moon and the Moonlight Choir, it was hard to view the celestial silver body with anything other than animosity and dread. As the duo continued through the darkened Ponyville streets, Twilight couldn't help but gaze up to the moon every now and again. Questions bounced to and fro in her mind, begging for answers. But every attempt to poke and prod at the Pegasus who had these answers was frustratingly met with the same old response.
For the last time, I'm not going to tell you.
Dash's resolved confirmation was just as stern and unwavering the sixth time as it was the first. She wasn't going to budge on this subject anytime soon, and that was a hard pill to swallow. But it was understandable. Twilight could admit that much. The Alicorn was the one who was butting in where she didn't have any real reason to do so, from a legal standpoint at least, so she was lucky she wasn't being arrested right now. Though perhaps that had something to do with Dash knowing that Twilight was an Alicorn, and not being sure if she could even subdue her. Either that or Dash was just so bad at keeping these kinds of secrets that she let Twilight help as a method of damage control. The exact reason behind Twilight being allowed to contribute wasn't really all that important in the end, especially not after it was made clear where Dash was going. How Twilight didn't guess that the Golden Oaks Library was their destination was a bit of a mystery. It was kind of obvious. When investigating a crime, go to the crime scene. They were approaching the building from off to the side, the part of the building that had the fewest windows. Obviously a measure to try and prevent detection on Rainbow's part. And the desire to remain discreet was made clear when she subtly gestured for Twilight to keep her head low as they drew closer to the building.
I'm guessing you've met old Onwood by now,
Dash said in a somewhat casual tone as she began converting a series of nearby bushes into a makeshift hiding spot.
Not to typecast, but you always were a bookworm last I checked.
Once she was satisfied with her work, her attention was turned towards the window nearest to the front entrance. She pressed her face up against the glass and squinted, peering into the darkened library for any sign of movement.
You could say that.
Twilight didn't think it would be very wise to bring up her current employment at this facility. She was lucky enough that she wasn't facing any serious repercussions for tagging along on this officially sanctioned endeavor of Rainbow's. At least none as of yet, and she didn't want to try and say anything that could potentially link her to this criminal. That was the plan, at any rate. But Twilight wasn't even given a chance to say anything incriminating, as she soon had to deal with the sensation of Dash wrapping a leg around her neck and yanking her down towards the ground. There wasn't even time to register what had happened before Twilight found herself nestled beside her former flying coach with the bush-made fort.
Rainbow, what are you quiet?
Dash hissed in response, pushing a few leaves out of the way so the two could peer into the outside world.
Somebody's coming out.
The creaky sound of the Golden Oaks door opening was the next thing to reach Twilight's ears, just as Dash had said. Rainbow Dash slowly and carefully shuffled forward and lifted her head to peer over the shrubbery, actions that were carefully mimicked by Twilight. Though much to her shock, there wasn't one pony stepping out of the building, but two. And Twilight was actually able to recognize both of them. It was strange seeing Nox Onwood after the events of the past few days. It seemed like yesterday Twilight thought of him as nothing more than a kindly old stallion who ran the library. But now she wasn't quite sure what to think. He was definitely dangerous, or at the very least he had ill intentions. This assumption was only reinforced by the look in his eyes. There was only the slightest opportunity to see his expression from this angle, but that was all it took to see that it was cold, cunning, and yet oddly satisfied. The closest comparison would be that of an evil mastermind whose schemes had come to fruition. And it gave Twilight the chills. Then there was the matter of the second pony, whose most noticeable trait was the silver watch hanging around her neck. The very same mare who had shown up the other day with that dusty old book, now confirmed to be working with the old Sarosian in whatever scheme he was brewing. She was walking a short way ahead of him, almost as if he were walking around as a host would a houseguest. The look on her face was far more dreary than her companion. Either she was very tired, or not at all happy about whatever it was that had happened there. Once outside, the unicorn turned around to begin addressing the old Sarosian, who still had his back turned towards the building, and by extension, Twilight and Rainbow. Though the exact details of how this conversation started were lost on Twilight, thanks to Rainbow and her sudden urge to think out loud.
Who in the world is that?
Rainbow almost silently muttered, just barely loud enough for Twilight to hear. Though it was evident that the question wasn't for the nearby alicorn, it didn't do much to stop Twilight from giving an answer. After all, it was this exact moment where Twilight managed to remember that mare's name.
Starlight Glimmer.
Her realization was noticeably louder than Dash's, made evident when Starlight's head darted to the side. Her eyes peered right past Nox, and fell on the series of shrubs that Twilight and Rainbow were hiding in. There was a flicker of shock in her eyes, but she made no other outward announcement of her discovery. Instead, she simply stared at the bushes. And both of the mares hiding within the flora froze on the spot. Through the gap in the leaves that had been made, Twilight could clearly see that the other's mares were locked solely on her. Their eyes were locked in spite of the distance, light, and everything else between them that should have served to hinder it. Twilight wasn't even sure if the unicorn could see her or not. She shouldn't have been able to. But given the way she was staring, Twilight honestly wasn't sure. "What is it?" Nox's voice cut through the darkness and tension of the situation, the stallion having noticed Starlight's loss of focus. His tone was cold and sharp as a brutal knife, even offering his own piercing gaze towards the bushes. Yet unlike his friend, he didn't seem to notice anything out of the ordinary.
Nothing. I think it was just a squirrel or something.
Starlight responded. She looked away from the makeshift hiding place and back to her associate.
It's not important.
You may be right. Nox gazed at the bushes for a brief bit longer, before turning back to Starlight. I suppose we're both a little bit jumpy. The big night is just around the corner.
Speaking of, I've actually been thinking about that.
There was a slightly nervous chortle as she continued, gesturing with a huff in an almost overly casual way.
We've both been working really hard getting everything ready. So I was thinking that maybe we both deserve a little reward for our hard work. Nothing too fancy, maybe a couple of drinks between friends.
The offer was made with all the tact and grace of a child asking for their birthday presents early. There was some kind of ulterior motive behind the suggestion, that much was clear. But whatever it was, she was the only one who knew it. Her words were left to hang awkwardly in the air for a time, leaving a gracious opportunity for the three other ponies to try and decipher whatever it was she meant. To Twilight's ears, the offer sounded forced and improvised, even more so considering that it came after her supposed discovery of the two hiding in the bushes, almost as if she didn't want her Sarosian friend to make the same realization. But no matter what angle Twilight approached the question from, the reasons that drove those actions remained elusive. "I'm sorry, what?" Nox responded after a pause, his tone making it clear that he was surprised by her suggestion.
Well, it's just, we're probably more than a bit overworked, I'm not going to lie. And we've done more than our fair share for the cause.
Starlight continued with a shrug.
Who's to say that we can't take one night to unwind?
We have been pulling most of the weight. A wing flexed around from his back, being used to scratch at his chin as he pondered the unicorn's words. Even from her limited perspective, Twilight was able to parse that the offer was being considered heavily. That much is true.
Well, then let's just go. You've been in town for a few years now. Surely you found a good bar or a pub by now? My treat.
Nox's ears perked up before an almost giddy chuckle escaped his throat. Why didn't you open with that? That was all it took for the two to be on their way. They only lingered for a moment to allow the elder to lock the door, and then they were off, Nox leading the way, seeming as if he already had an establishment in mind for the evening. Starlight followed dutifully behind, only offering the library a short, brief glimpse back before heading off. Twilight watched the two of them leave without a further shred of attention being spared on her or Rainbow. Even still, she didn't move from her hiding spot, still worried that she'd be caught by one of them. And that worry kept her frozen in place and kept her breath slow and shallow. This sentiment was not shared by Rainbow, however, and it wasn't long before she practically threw herself out of the shrubs with great enthusiasm. She spun on her hooves and glared back at Twilight.
There's no way she didn't see us, she barked through gritted teeth. Why did you blow our cover? You're the one who asked who she was.
Twilight gave her rebuttal as she stood up herself, shaking loose the leaves that had clung to her and her cloak while she stepped forward.
But I didn't ask loud enough to be heard from Canterlot.
Dash groaned and rolled her eyes in frustration, clearly regretting a number of decisions she had made tonight. But instead of telling Twilight to take a hike, or arresting her, she instead went over to the library's front door and began investigating the locked barricade.
Well, you seem to know her. Care to share with the rest of the class? I've only met her one time. Frankly, I'm surprised I remembered her name. She was returning a book. I think you already know which one.
Dash murmured back as she freed one of her wings from beneath her saddlebags. She was only half paying attention to Twilight as she swiftly plucked two of her own feathers. These feathers were then taken by her hooves and skillfully inserted into the keyhole, with Dash beginning to twist and push them about methodically.
Anything else? Only that she was acting really nervous,
Twilight recalled aloud. She stopped for a moment to try and recollect her previous encounter with that mare, as she hadn't put much thought into it since it had happened. The memories were a bit fuzzy, but clear enough to pull an answer from.
It was like she was afraid of me, if I had to guess.
And guessing was as far as she could go with that strange mare. Rainbow shifted her attention back to Twilight for a moment, a look of concerned curiosity on her face. But just as quickly as Twilight had regained the Black Hoof's attention, it was lost when Rainbow returned her attention to the locked door. It was only now that she could be bothered to pay attention to whatever it was that her old flying coach was doing, still fidgeting about with those two feathers she had stuck into the door's lock. There seemed to be a method to her madness, as the movements were very precise. It was obvious enough what she was trying to do, as impossible as it seemed to be with simple feathers. And it was made even clearer as the lock clicked, and the door swung open with a nudge of Dash's hoof, much to Twilight's astonishment and the Pegasus's delight.
Did you just pick a lock with some feathers? Yes, I did.
The Pegasus was practically a glowing beacon of pride.
Pretty cool, right?
Twilight slowly nodded with a slight shrug. Even she couldn't deny that that was pretty impressive.
So, was that a Wonderbolt trick or a Black Hoof trick? Neither. That one came from my dad.
That was the last time that Dash's feat was brought up, Twilight having nothing further to add after that particular tidbit. Of course she had learned that skill from someone in her family. It just made too much sense. And Twilight shuddered at the thought of what kind of stallion would teach his daughter to pick a lock. Probably the same kind of father who would raise a pony like Rainbow, all things considered. Probably someone very loud and very bombastic. Someone Twilight was glad wasn't at the train station earlier today, for better or worse. This brief bit of mental wandering was cut short when Dash stepped into the library, cutting off Twilight from entering herself.
So, I know I said I'd let you help out and all,
Dash began to murmur in an almost pleading manner.
But is there any chance that helping out can translate to keeping watch?
The nonchalantly narrow-eyed look that Twilight responded with was worth 1,000 words. And it got Twilight's point across without fail, made clear when Dash let out a low groan of defeat.
Yep, I figured as much. Come on then, who knows how long we have until they come back.
Twilight couldn't help but smirk at that as she followed Rainbow into the building, making sure to close the door behind her to cover their tracks. The library was a setting that Twilight had become very familiar with during her extended stay in Ponyville. But entering the place at night was like walking into another world. Doubly so, now that she had some vague idea of the sinister machinations that were being housed here. Without the lamps and the sunlight, the space was almost oppressively darkened by intense shadows, contrasted by the pale moonlight as it filtered into the room through the windows. But even this was only a reminder of the dangers that lurked further within. The two wasted no time in searching the bottom floors. They both knew that the secrets were held in the third floor. So they ascended, the old stairs creaking beneath their hooves with almost every step. And with every step they took, the light of the moon became fainter and fainter, and the darkness all but swallowed them whole. Soon enough, Twilight and Dash found themselves at the closed door leading to the third floor. It towered over them like a monolith, or at least it seemed to Twilight, in what little light was able to reach this place. And while Twilight found herself hesitating at the prospect of going forward, Rainbow showed no such concerns as she pushed the door open. The old hinges creaked as the barricade was pushed to the side, and their eyes were met with an absolutely pitch-black abyss. It was as if this was where the world ended, and all that was beyond this point was an infinite, inky void. A void that Rainbow Dash walked headlong into without any hesitation. And like a canary in a coal mine, the Black Hoof's action served an important role in letting Twilight know that the room wasn't booby-trapped. Or at least not trapped in the way of making the room explode upon unauthorized entry, or something else as ridiculously over the top, which was better than nothing, all things considered.
Hey, Egghead!
Dash's voice echoed out of the darkness, almost startling Twilight.
I'm letting you tag along on my job. Could you at least give me some light?
Getting over her brief moment of unnecessary surprise, Twilight rolled her eyes and stepped into the darkness. As requested, her horn became enveloped in arcane light, though the glow from her horn wasn't nearly as bright as what she was capable of, and the spell didn't last anywhere near as long. Instead, the magenta aura condensed into a small, dim sphere at the tip of her horn, no bigger than a firefly, and it lazily drifted up towards the center of the ceiling. This was intentional on Twilight's part, as she had something a bit more potent in mind than just a simple glowing horn.
I had something a bit brighter in mind.
By the sound of it, Dash wasn't exactly impressed with Twilight's spell.
Don't look directly at it.
Twilight heeded her own warning by averting her gaze, tightly shutting her eyes for good measure. Alas, her suggestion fell on deaf ears, evidenced by the loud, "Huh?" that was uttered by Rainbow Dash. And then it happened. A loud arcane pop served as a signal that it was safe to open one's eyes. But that sudden sense of safety was contradicted by a loud shriek of mixed surprise and pain, followed by the unmistakable thud of a grown mare falling to the ground in a heap. The gift of sight wasn't needed to figure out what had happened. Rainbow simply hadn't listened to Twilight's sage advice. Twilight corrected her posture and opened her eyes, greeted not to darkness, but instead to what could almost be compared to sunlight. In the newfound illumination, she was free to see exactly what was held within this space. It was remarkably accurate to Fluttershy's testimony, the dusty and derelict room being littered with various desks and tables, some clothed, some not. Each had a number of books resting on them, some of which Twilight actually recognized. She had sold some of these to Nox during her first few days. Thick-looking tarps held the windows hostage, responsible for the oppressive darkness that she had just banished. The largest difference from the story was what hung in the air in the center of the room, a glowing sphere that could accurately be described as a miniature sun. While not nearly as intense as the celestial body it was designed to mimic, it was more than bright enough to cause discomfort if one were to look right at it. Doubly so while it was in the process of forming. And, speaking of which, a stunned Rainbow Dash could be found lying on the floor a few steps away from Twilight. The shocked mare rubbed at her eyes in some vain attempt to undo what had already been done, moaning and groaning in an almost disoriented manner. But it wasn't long before the Pegasus was able to collect her bearings, shakily dragging herself off the ground with a bit of assistance from Twilight. It took longer for her to open her now impossibly dilated and watery eyes, rapidly blinking them as she tried to regain her sight. She wouldn't suffer any permanent damage, thankfully enough, made clear when Dash angrily turned her furious gaze to Twilight.
What the buck was that?
Angry was too weak of a word to describe the cadence carried in Dash's question.
Portable sunlight.
Twilight had to fight back a bit of a giggle at her friend's overblown reaction.
Just a little trick I picked up from the Queen back in the day. You could have given me a heads up. I told you not to look at it.
The Pegasus remained silent, staring bitterly at Twilight for a moment before walking away and shaking her head. Something was muttered under her breath as she did so, and then she turned back to Twilight.
Okay. You can go ahead and help me look around.
Dash attempted to give her instructions as neutrally as possible, in spite of the fact that she was still clearly a bit miffed.
But don't touch anything. Don't read anything. Don't even breathe on anything. The only thing you do is tell me if you see anything suspicious and then look away.
Twilight cocked an eyebrow at the strange set of requests.
Then, what's the point of me being here? Because me bringing you was the easier option since you wouldn't just let this go, you nosy brat.
The answer came bluntly enough to get Dash's feelings across.
Besides, I can't legally let a civilian do any investigation. But if you just so happen to be here while I'm doing my job, and you just so happen to report something odd to me, then that is fine.
A not-so-subtle wink followed before Dash ceased giving Twilight any real attention. She processed the term she had been given for a short time before shaking her head and just moving along with her own search. She wasn't really in any position to be complaining about not being allowed to break the law any more than she already was. Being here at all was the compromise that Twilight had been wanting, so it wouldn't be a good idea to try and pry for anything more than she already had. And so she went forward, beginning her search for the answers to many of her questions. How it took her so long to try coming in here herself was baffling, but she was finally ready to search the lion's den. Thankfully, the past few days had given her some vague idea of what to look for. The old book she'd been seeing in her dreams, as well as the two unusual objects that Fluttershy described in her story. A strange necklace and some kind of black stone. They weren't the most specific of descriptions, but it was better than nothing.